There are so many risks when it comes to investing in the stock market, right? The one risk that I've been thinking about for a while is the single country risk. And I've talked about this single country risk a lot over the last year or so. But I want to make like my thoughts on like how it can be overcome, and like how this can be reduced, right? So if there is a risk, like as an investor, as someone who's advising your clients, right, like the goal is to minimize the risk and maximize the outcome for your clients, right? So this chart that I'm showing here tells how different countries have gone through cycles, right? There were times when US was not the best, right? UK was the best market. There were times when Japanese market was the best market, right? So going forward, assuming that all countries go through a lot of cycles, right, and no one country is going to rule them all, it's very difficult to just pick one market and then just go with it, right? So currently, over the last, I don't know, 30 years, I think US market has always been the tier for all investors, right? Like everyone who wants to get away from the home exposure immediately invest in the S&P 500, which basically gives you exposure to the top tech companies, top companies in the US market, right? But US market is also like a single country risk, right? Just from thinking from a risk perspective, and let's for a moment, right, park the return discussion, because when you think about return, S&P 500 has done well over the other indices, right? Maybe not over the last year or so, right? Given that the other countries are also like the other developed markets they have been doing well as well over the last year or so. So what I want to quickly show is like uh, uh, pointed out the single country risk, right, where you see a lot of drawdowns, countries going through a lot of cycles, right? We can see like USA had like a Great Depression during 1929, where the US stock market went down by a lot, and you can see different countries here, right, going through cycles. So what I want to quickly show is like what are these things can be reduced, right? So first thing that comes to everyone's mind is like S&P 500, right? Like to get away from the home exposure, that is the home risk, right? Home risk is also like a single country risk. So you can see that okay, S&P 500 is one way to diversify your risk if you have heavy home exposure. Let's say you're in India, you're in any other country, right? You probably might have exposure to the that country's risk, right? So just for the sake of an example, in India, a lot of people will have exposure to the Nifty 50 or the Indian mutual funds, right? That gives you exposure to the Indian companies. So one way to get around to diversify that home country or the single country risk is to maybe pick another country. In this case, I think everybody falls back to S&P 500, right? But again, S&P 500 and having a home country is also like you're betting on two countries, right? And going forward, assuming that you don't know which country is going to do well, right? Like currently, you might predict one or two countries. Again, the reason to go with passive is to avoid those predictions, right? The next thing that comes to my mind is like a world ETF, right? That gives you exposure to all developed markets in the world. So you don't need to pick which index or which country is going to do well. MSCI World ETF, it automatically rebalances. Let's say the next country is going to do well. All the top talent, all the top tech companies is going to do well is UK, let's say, right? Just for an example, then you don't need to do anything, right? You don't need to in 5 years down the line. You think that hey, this other country which is actually doing well and attracting top talent, and like there's a lot of companies and the economy is booming, right? You can just sit quietly and let the index automatically rebalance, right? And we can also see that in the top 10 markets, right? That United's like S&P 500, obviously it's like almost 100%, right? Whereas the world ETF is like 70%. Again, there's a problem, right? You have heavy exposure to the US market. Again, this comes with uh, having a lot of big companies in the US market, right? So how do you overcome that? Maybe one thing that the next thing that comes to mind is like an ACWI index, right? Which is, so MSCI World is like all developed countries, whereas ACWI, the ACWI means like all country world index, right? So it gives the exposure to developed markets as well as like emerging markets as well, right? So in a way, you can reduce the risk caused by MSCI World by reducing. So the thing that we are discussing now is again like the problem statement has changed a bit, right? Now from diversifying to all countries, we are now focusing on reducing the exposure to the US market, right? So from 98 we have come down to 71. Now we have come down to 63% with active index, right? You will definitely have some exposure to the emerging markets, emerging markets and like yeah, so there will be some emerging markets, there will be some United States, but still the problem is having heavy exposure, right? 60%, right? How can we reduce this further, right? And this is probably like kind of my favorite index. Like I've been in love with this index for a while, which is the MWEP, which is basically the MSCI World Equal Weighted Index, right? So all these indices are market cap weighted, and I think the difference is like the weightage, right? The if all the big companies are going to get more weightage, then of course like the MSCI World and the ACWI index are they're going to get uh, heavily tilted towards the United States market, right? Because the big companies, the big market cap companies are in the US. So one way to again reduce the exposure is to choose the MSCI World Equal Weighted Index, which automatically decreases your US exposure by a huge margin, right? So it's from 63 to 39%, right? So if you compare that to having 100% exposure to having 40% exposure, that's a huge reduction in single country risk. And this is just like trying to reduce the United States exposure, right? And over the last year or so, right? Year or so, I think you can still see that all these other world ETF, ACWI, S&P 500, they almost perform the same. The equal weighted kind of underperformed the all the other indices, right? But the main goal of this video is to think or to let you think more in terms of like how these reduce, how these risks can be reduced, and how to think about single country risk itself, right? So these are my no four ETFs, right? That I thought I'll say, okay, so if you wanna get away from the home market, you go into S&P 500. Then if S&P 500 is again comes up with US exposure, then you go into world ETF. Then world ETF, again, the problem is it's heavily tilted towards US with 70% exposure. Then you go into ACWI, which gives you exposure to more markets, right? Emerging markets as well. But again, the problem is like the same problem with MSCI World, right? It also has heavy exposure, about 63% to the US market. To reduce all these risks and to reduce the US exposure, you basically change the weighting scheme, right? Do you go into the MSCI World Equal Weighted Index? That's it for this video. Thanks a lot for watching. I will see you with another comparison soon. Thank you.